Hey folks, we're kicking off week 4 today. We are so close to being done. Hang in there and keep up the great work. I know I'm asking a lot, but I'm really impressed with the quality of the work this summer. The reading reflections, the cookbook analysis, you're doing a fantastic job. The cookbook analysis is probably the best set I've seen in any iteration of this class. I thought you did a great job. That's exactly what you should do for your food blog analysis that's due on Wednesday. And despite the breakneck pace of this class, I hope you're enjoying the readings. If not, there's only a couple more, so we're almost done, but well done. Today's topic is culinary appropriation, a more specific kind of cultural appropriation. And surely you've heard about cultural appropriation, probably in the context of Halloween, where people tend to dress up as a kind of person or cultural group. And that act of imitation, even if there's no ill will intended, can be perceived as insulting or disrespectful, or it can actually be insulting or disrespectful. We don't need to get hung up on definitions here, but it's useful to have a starting point for appropriation. So in very broad terms, I'd say this: cultural appropriation happens when members of a dominant cultural group adopt cultural elements of a minority group in an exploitative, disrespectful, or stereotypical way. And it's not just using something from another culture. That happens all the time in arts and fashion, music, literature, food. We all benefit from that kind of cultural blending. So the question really is, how does it get used, and is it done in a respectful way? And also scale matters. If a drunk white frat boy runs around at Halloween with a Native American headdress on, I think that's more like one person being rude or disrespectful or ignorant, whatever you want to call it, more than appropriation. But if a mainstream cultural institution run largely by white people adopts a Native American headdress as their logo or symbol or something like that, that's, however well-intentioned that might be, it could be intended to honor, a Native American history. That's a different kind of thing. That's where one group is really sort of controlling a symbol of another one. And that's something we should think more about. So today, we're looking at how to think critically about cultural appropriation in terms of food, also known as culinary appropriation. Arguably, the whole class has been about culinary appropriation, given all the borrowing and mingling of flavors and ingredients and traditions we've seen sort of throughout the class. We've talked around this issue a lot, but I think it's worth focusing on the idea just for one day here. We could get into lots of theory and philosophy and specific case studies. We don't need to do that. We'll just hit the main points. But before we get into any real analysis, I want to set the table, so to speak. 3 preliminary points. The first point is to recognize that culinary appropriation, like cultural appropriation, is in fact a real thing and deserves real attention. As I mentioned on the syllabus, I find most culinary appropriation conversations to be totally unhelpful because they're so superficial and they adopt very polarized or reductive views that sort of don't even address the key issues. It's pointless, in my opinion, to debate whether culinary or cultural appropriation actually happens. It absolutely does. Some people say no one owns culture, there's no rigid cultural boundaries, there's no sort of cultural authority to say this is yours and this is yours. Cultures are always sort of blending anyway, as I just mentioned. But I think that's a really kind of head in the sand view that basically says that cultural preservation is either impossible or unimportant, or that cultural symbols can go anywhere they want without any kind of consequence. If you respect and value cultural difference and cultural meanings, in this case of food, I think appropriation has serious consequences, and we need to think about those. Similarly, it's also pointless to suggest that it's really just some people being overly sensitive about cultural boundaries. It is true that people can be overly sensitive to cultural borrowing. You probably can think of a case where a white celebrity got cornrows or got a sort of a tribal tattoo or something where people yelled out, cultural appropriation, you can't do that. One article we read for today talks about how, blurting out cultural appropriation is a fast track to moral high ground. It can be taken too seriously, for sure, but the issue goes way beyond people overreacting to it. Lastly, it's pointless to debate whether culinary appropriation can be either an inadvertent or purposeful tool of marginalization of one group by another. This is a non-debatable historical fact that we've seen over and over just in this class. So what matters for us is not whether culinary appropriation exists, because it does, or whether it can be overblown, it can, or whether it's actually harmful or not, because it certainly can be. The issue is this. One of the great things about American food that most of you have expressed at some point or multiple times in all your assignments is the variety and fusion nature of it. It's kind of a unique culinary heritage in itself. Whether you define that as American food or say there's no such thing as American food, that fusion blending is pretty unique. But we have to ask whether certain food histories and how they're tied to different cultural traditions and identities can become essentially lost because they get associated with something or someone totally different than the original group that they were important to. We have to figure out how to navigate opposite ends of the spectrum here. We don't want one cultural group who's more privileged than another one, able to have more commercial success because of greater access to capital, more free time, access to other kinds of resources. We don't want them exploiting some other group's cultural symbol, food or otherwise. We don't want that. No one wants that. But we also don't want to have to take a DNA test to see if we're allowed to serve a certain kind of food or incorporate a certain kind of tradition in our own lives. Right? We don't want that either. So how do we find that middle ground? What matters for us, we're not going to figure anything out in this class, you know that. But what matters for us today is how we can learn to think and talk about appropriation, in terms of food at least, in a sufficiently nuanced way so that we can encourage both cultural innovation and adaptation and blending and mingling that we've seen, as well as simultaneously respecting cultural heritage and meanings. So much for the long-winded intro, a brief overview of the readings here. We start with Michael Twitty and a chapter from his first book, The Cooking Gene. Twitty's an immensely talented food writer who sort of burst on the scene a few years ago. You'll see in the chapter for today how he describes that he used to do cooking demonstrations. I think he still does a little bit, but he's more of a writer now, I think. He used to do cooking demonstrations on plantations, so historical reenactment type stuff. He'd gather wood, chop the wood, make fires, tend to fires all day, do all the food prep, grow the food in the garden, make meals as his enslaved ancestors did. And one of the main reasons he does this recreation stuff is to grapple with the lost history of his enslaved ancestors. He's African-American, also Jewish, also gay, so he's got a lot of blending of cultural backgrounds in his own life, and this has made him very interested in his own heritage and identity. For Twitty, food, ingredients, recipes, and cooking is a way of recovering sort of a lost memory of his own heritage, or heritages, I should say. In the chapter we're reading, he talks a lot about appropriation, but he doesn't really come out and say, I'm going to talk about appropriation, which I think is smart, because otherwise people would tune out and say, I don't want to deal with this. But he's talking about what food means to him as an African American, and what food traditions mean to him, and how they've get portrayed in different ways. So appropriation is at the heart of what he's saying, even if he's not sort of flagging it as some of the other articles do. Twitty is challenging us to understand the idea of Southern food from his point of view, and to think about how so much of what we consider Southern food or soul food is really African food. But as he explains, it was sort of appropriated by white Southerners, mostly in the 19th century, but still going on today. And he talks about how, many upper middle class white chefs are reinventing Southern food as if it's fundamentally their heritage. And in a way it is. It's their family traditions. It's their food. It's the stuff they grew up with. So it's theirs too. But of course there's a longer history to this food that often gets ignored or sort of whitewashed. And we lose track of where these culinary contributions really came from. We've read a little bit about this already, but he's presenting this issue in a very personal way that I think gives it a pretty interesting valence. Anyway, it's usually one of the more popular readings for the class, so I hope you enjoy it. There's also a short video of Twitty himself talking about these issues, and he's a fun speaker to listen to. It's just a couple of minutes, 4 or 5 minutes long, so I hope you'll check that out too. To add what Twitty is saying, and just in the context of today's theme, it's important and necessary to emphasize that virtually no one who is accused of culinary appropriation is trying to erase anyone's heritage or identity or obscure anyone's traditions or steal anything. Most people are doing stuff, in terms of food at least, because they love the food, they love the flavors, they love the culture, they love what it stands for and what it represents, and they're trying to spread that and share it with as many people as possible. That's a good thing. But is there a danger that inadvertently the process of adaptation and sharing this stuff that isn't part of your culinary heritage can more or less erase the heritage, or obscure it at least, of certain communities? Maybe this is inevitable with all food traditions. Maybe we lose track of true origins and we just have folklore and mythology, and that's just inevitable. And it may be tempting to think it's necessarily inevitable. That's just how the world is. But I'd like to suggest that there's no default setting to appropriation of other traditions. We can make a choice of what stays where or how we talk about things through our everyday actions. The second article we're reading from, Jess Kadapia, says, so what? Cultural appropriation, culinary appropriation. One of my favorite quotes from the article, I sort of referenced this a second ago. It feels good to say cultural appropriation. It rolls off the tongue nicely, sounds intellectual, and all of a sudden you're on the road to moral superiority. As someone who's said cultural appropriation about 1 million times in the last couple of days trying to get ready for this video, I can say that is in fact false. It does not roll off the tongue at all, but it does have that sort of valence of like when you criticize somebody for culturally appropriating something, you sound like you are a cultural arbiter, like you are respecting these traditions and you have some superior knowledge about sort of how to act or behave. Kadapia doesn't think cultural appropriation is a big deal. It either doesn't exist or it doesn't matter for her. Through the article, you find out she has a lot of personal experiences of eating really great food from one place in another place. And this is her sort of experience that leads her to believe that everything's mingling all the time anyway. But like the authenticity is bullshit article, she seems to miss the big picture. I think she makes a lot of great points. That's why I put it on the syllabus. But she also doesn't really seem to understand the social consequences of appropriation. And she looks at it in very sort of narrow ways. So her position seems to be that any claims of cultural appropriation are really just people overreacting to it. But as I said before, look, we see over and over again how close food and identity and heritage are intimately intertwined historically. And if that continues to be true, and we don't have any reason to believe it won't be, maybe whitewashing ethnic and racial and geographic diversity that's inherent to food traditions is not the best thing to be doing. So I hope you'll find that article a little simplistic. But again, she does describe, I think very nicely, many reasons why appropriation can be a good thing. But we have to also keep in mind the bigger pictures of the dangers that she doesn't quite get into. The last article, kind of a complement to the second, we get a more specific case study on Nashville hot chicken. Maybe some of you have had this. I don't like spicy food, so I'm never going to eat Nashville hot chicken. The article is asking whether it's okay or fair that a couple of white dudes have opened something like 300 Nashville hot chicken places around the country, and the black family that started the food tradition that runs the original place has 2 restaurants. Clearly, the Anglos have had more commercial success, and maybe the original owners aren't interested in that, so maybe everything's fine. But does that kind of commercial success of something like Nashville hot chicken, a very sort of specific local dish, does it sort of erase or at least erode the contributions of the black Nashville neighborhoods that created and nurtured and popularized it? I think this article does a very nice job of canvassing a lot of the key issues of culinary appropriation. Doesn't have any answers for us, of course, but again, we're just trying to think about it and talk about it more effectively. Beyond Nashville hot chicken, we can also think about another famous chicken place, KFC. What comes to mind? Buckets of fried chicken, of course, and the Colonel. A genteel, white, Southern gentleman with a secret recipe, right? Not an African American supporting their family by selling fried chicken to whites who would ride a train just to get to fried chicken. It was so good, right? That's not the emblem. I'm not attempting to summarize the readings for you here, so I'll stop. In conclusion, though, I'd like to make one suggestion that I hope you keep in mind as you go through the readings. I don't think any race, culture, ethnicity, nationality can own any kind of food and say, this is mine, you can't deal with it. I don't want to live in a world where you can only sell a certain food or make a certain food if your skin is a certain color, your body's a certain shape, or your genes indicate that you're authorized to do this. You have sufficient heritage and history in order to share it with other people. I don't want a part of that society. I'd like to suggest that maybe the problem isn't really appropriation itself. That's what we're reading about for today. But maybe the problem is more a lack of food literacy. Can more awareness of food history, something we typically don't learn much about, you guys are the exceptions, obviously, smart people, but can more knowledge of food history and food cultures and traditions smooth over some of the downsides of appropriation? Would more food literacy, more food history knowledge prevent the meanings and heritage and identities associated with certain foods and dishes from disappearing, as the main fear of appropriation is? To go back to Twitty for a second, that's why he does the food reenactments, so that people can understand and see for themselves that soul food or Southern food isn't just Southern in sort of the stereotypical American sense, but comes directly from enslaved persons who kept recipes and tended gardens in their minuscule spare time to keep these recipes and traditions alive, even though at the time they had no hope of actually going out in the world and doing anything with them. But here we are with Southern and soul food, a vibrant part of our American food tradition, but we don't call it African food. Look, I don't think we need a history lesson when we're trying to order food. I've mentioned this in an earlier video. I think if there's anyone who would love that, it's me. I definitely don't. But I think the question of appropriation of food and cultural traditions and whether or not it can go too far is very important to keep in mind, given the close connections between food, heritage, and identity that we've seen throughout the course. I'm looking forward to reading what you think about appropriation, what you think the key issues are, what you think solutions might be. Do you agree with me? Food history is important? I don't know. You'll let me know. Please make sure you're showing your familiarity with the readings. That's the main goal of these assignments. That's what we're looking for. Bring in previous readings if you can. That's a great way of showing that you're learning from the course. Definitely an easy way to get extra credit points. So looking forward to your responses. Enjoy the readings. See you tomorrow.